Hi, Lou here to ask what kinds of games and mechanisms make people think the most when they play games. Now, keep in mind, and the reason I ask this is thinking is not popular, especially in entertainment. Real thinking is hard. Most people don't want any hard in their entertainment. Now, by thinking, I don't mean intuition or heuristics rule of thumb. I mean thinking. And here are a couple of quotes. George Bernard Shaw, 2% of the people think, 3% of the people think they think, and 95% of the people would rather die than think. Henry Ford, thinking is the hardest work there is, which is why so few people engage in it. So what games or mechanisms make you think most? Well, abstracts have always put an additional burden of thinking on the player because there's no context to help the player understand what they're doing and what's going on. So by abstract games, I mean ones that don't represent anything. Chess, checkers, Go, and the like, and many modern games too. Now you can have a game with an atmosphere or decoration attached, or even something some people call a theme, and that doesn't help you play because it's tacked on. It doesn't have anything to do with how the game plays, and then you're still in the same boat. And there are many modern games that are abstract but have this decoration tacked on. Games that have no paths to victory that you must follow, in other words, opposed games generally, make you think. You can't simply follow one of the paths. Now in Euro-style games, you follow the paths. The games also limit a player severely by reducing the hindrance and help possibilities that you have in opposed games to next to nothing. So, you just don't have those options. You don't have to think about them. This is one of the reasons why the Euro games tend to be puzzles rather than, and usually more than, games. Euros are usually designed to have relatively few clear decisions, also reducing the cognitive load. So you can look at Euro games in general, the typical Euro game, not the ones that have lasted, as games intended to reduce the cognitive load on people and not make them think. In other words, the old version of Euros as family games on steroids. Somewhat more thinking than family games, or somewhat more having to pay attention anyway and not relying on luck. Casual games, which is often what we talk about in video games rather than party games, are more or less the video form of party games. The players don't particularly care if they win in either case, and highly developed skills are not required to play decently. If you want to play really well, then often you have to really pay attention and think about it, but to play decently you don't need to do that. Now we have different versions of how people play games: logic, intuition, and heuristics. Logic is hard and usually requires thinking. It's precise. Close is not good enough. Intuition is the ability to understand something immediately without the need for conscious reasoning. It's simpler and quicker than logic and not as taxing. Heuristics, or rules of thumb, are even simpler, and they're how many people play games. Little or no thought required. You just know the rule of thumb and you follow it. Precision is something that makes people think. It's a case where close is not good enough. But the K-12 schools in the USA appear to teach the opposite, that close is good enough. This idea that close is okay is not a formula for success in a game that requires a lot of thinking. Puzzles tend to occupy the brain more because of the prospect of an always correct solution. But it's not always so much thinking as trying to figure out what the puzzle maker intended, or just trying to figure out which course of action will work, because there are no consequences if you fail to take that course of action in the long run. You just back up and take a different course of action. Players search for that solution, and that search may lead to analysis paralysis. This is why chess, which is a supremely complex puzzle, too complex for humans, requires chess clocks. Two-player and one-player games require more thinking more than games for more than two. Now why? Well, keep in mind party games and family games are games for more than two, but I'm talking about hobby games. But even in hobby games, you're playing against other people. You're playing the people in those kinds of games. And so it's a lot more psychology involved than pure logic. And sometimes when psychology is involved, intuition is a superior tool. Perhaps the notion of don't make me think is the reason why so many tabletop and even video games are for more than two people nowadays. Of course, sociability is another reason. There are lots of other reasons. Reducing the number of choices is always a way to make games less about thinking. Card games are a way to have fewer choices. And if you walk around a college tabletop game club, you'll see many more non-collectible card games being played than board games. And that's not even considering the collectible card games, which can dominate on their own. What about games of maneuver and geospatial relationships, as in war games? How does that fit in? Well, these tend to be high player interaction games, whereas something like a Euro game tends to be very low interaction. You have to watch for and react to what the other players do. These games also offer many choices. So, we could ask, is there more thinking in high than low player interaction games? Clearly yes, in my view. What about generalship? Generalship in the real world often involves yomi, reading the intentions of the opponent and taking advantage of those intentions. Though historical conflict games often reflect generalship as a form of minimax and game theory rather than rely on yomi, and that's partly because many of those games don't hide much information. And that ultimately is because players want to feel in control of what happens. Often players of those games are planners, but that's not how real warfare works. Now we have other methods of design that have been introduced recently being the last 30 years, let's say. 40 years perhaps. Many games now encourage a corporate management style where the player is mostly manipulating resources. More generally, this can be called conversion games, converting something into victory points. This is as opposed to the older command style where the player is moving assets and attacking, defending with them, trying to hinder or help the other players, which does not exist in many corporate management games. Corporate management in this context has less pressure and usually fewer decisions than the command method. We also have the notion of coach versus general manager. Modern games often put a player in the position of a general manager of a sports team rather than a coach. That is, the GM requires players, assets, but doesn't make decisions during the play of the actual games. That's the coach's job. Now, older games often required players to do both, coach and GM or corporate management and command, whichever, and that required more thinking. So when you start a game design, keep these kinds of things in mind. How much do you want to make people think? Even an old serious player like me sometimes doesn't want to think much these days. And certainly that's the direction the market is going. Thanks for listening.